Anthony Casso is rightly considered one of the bloodiest mafiosi who's held the highest position in a mafia family, and his brutality sometimes went beyond the limits of reason, even by the rules of the Italian criminal world. But he wasn't the mindless butcher you might think. Casso sold tons of drugs of different kinds, organized robberies for millions of dollars, and participated in the main mafia scams of the late 20th century. He was just the kind of guy they say would have been successful in the legal world too. So if you're interested in hearing about a man who was talented in almost every aspect of the criminal trade, then meet Anthony Gaspipe Casso on the other side of the law. Anthony Casso was born on May 21, 1942 in Brooklyn. He was the third child in the family. Anthony's father, Michael Casso, worked as a dock worker in a Brooklyn shipyard. The Casso family never went hungry. Even in the hard times of the Great Depression, they managed to stay afloat, because one of the best friends of Michael Casso was Sal Calambrano, a capo of the Genovese family. It was Calambrano who became Anthony's godfather when he came into the world. Thanks to the patronage of his friend, there was always a job for Michael in New York Harbor. Michael Casso was also a regular at the City Democratic Club, which was started by Vincent Mangano. It was there, from the local boys, that Michael earned the nickname Gaspipe for his habit of carrying an 8-inch lead gas pipe that he often used in fights. This nickname would later be passed on to his son. Anthony's childhood years were spent in an atmosphere of love and care. At school, he didn't shine with talent. He was not interested in history or literature, but he took math seriously. It was not a matter of love for formulas and sleek logical constructions. From childhood, young Casso loved money, and as you know, money loves to be counted. His father often took Anthony with him on hunting trips. It was there in the forests of New Jersey that Casso first shot a gun. He loved guns and practiced shooting quite often. In time, young Anthony reached such a skill level that local dove owners hired him to shoot hawks. Beyond that, young Anthony was drawn to the street. He saw the respect his father's friends and the people around him at the club had for him. And so Anthony wanted to be the same. Anthony's father, who dreamed that his son would become a respected lawyer or doctor, at first tried to shield him from the influence of the streets, but later gave up on it. Pretty quickly, Anthony Casso became a member of the South Brooklyn Boys. These guys were far from serious gangsters, but having proven himself in fights, a young man could draw the attention of larger crime authorities. When Casso dropped out of school at 16, Calambrano got his godson a job at the dock. The fact that Anthony was a minor was no barrier. The godfather made him a fake birth certificate so that he could not only appear at work, but receive a paycheck every week. Also, through the mediation of the godfather, little Casso earned money at the festival of San Gennaro in Little Italy. This is how Anthony got his first money, and he enjoyed spending on clothes. Because of his good looks, as well as his ability to stand up for himself, he soon attracted the attention of Christopher "Christy Tick" Furnari. During those years, Christopher was a partner in the LUCCHESE family. He controlled illegal gambling and usury, but soon became a very influential member of the family. Furnari appreciated the young man and began to slowly pull him into the business. Now Anthony collected money from loan sharks and bookmakers. He also supervised the work of 2 illegal nightclubs, which operated after closing hours. Sometimes there were problems that Anthony had to solve by force, and so he made a habit of always carrying a gun. In the spring of 1961, 19-year-old Casso got into trouble. He stood up for a woman who was being harassed on the street by a guy named Bobby Bebop. According to another version, the girl sought Casso's help herself because of Bebop's harassment. Anthony knew both the girl and Bebop, whose uncle was a captain in the Genovese family. Casso ordered Bebop to leave the poor girl alone, and the latter responded by shoving him. A scuffle ensued between the boys, during which Anthony pulled out a gun and shot Bobby several times. He was immediately taken to the hospital, where despite the fact that the victim lost a lot of blood, doctors managed to save him. The situation threatened Anthony with a lot of problems. He immediately told his father and godfather about everything. At an emergency family council, it was decided that Casso should leave town for a while. While he shacked up at the country house of his girlfriend's parents, Casso's father tried to get him off the hook. Local police were ready to close the case in exchange for $50,000, but the Casso family at the time did not have such money. The situation was complicated by the fact that Bobby had already been discharged from the hospital. Together with his brother, he scoured New York City almost around the clock looking for Anthony. He visited a club where little Casso often spent time and showed the attendees a sawed-off shotgun, saying it was meant for Anthony. Anthony's father still managed to find a way out of this seemingly unsolvable situation. Through the mediation of Colin Brano, he managed to arrange a meeting with Bebop's uncle. It was decided that the older Casso would pay the victim's family $10,000 and Anthony would surrender to the police. As for Bobby, he would not be able to recognize Anthony as the shooter at the trial. Anthony was making good money, but the cash he earned was not enough for him. So, to increase his earnings, he partnered with truck drivers and proposed to them the following scheme. The driver of the truck, transporting some easily sellable goods like jeans, TV sets, or leather jackets, gave the truck to Casso in exchange for $10,000, and then reported to the police about the theft. Soon the police would find the truck, without the goods, which Anthony would sell to familiar fences. Later, Anthony also made useful acquaintances among the pier guards in New York Harbor, who were also not averse to making extra cash. In 1970, thanks to his earnings, Casso realized his parents' dream. He bought and gave them a small country house. Unfortunately for Anthony, his father did not have long to enjoy a scheduled life in the countryside. On December 19th of that same year, 1970, Michael Casso died. Anthony was shaken by the death of his father, who he owed a lot to. Casso found solace in his work. While his father was still alive, he led the Bypass Gang, which specialized in robbing jewelry stores and bank vaults. Waiting for the bank to close on Friday nights, Anthony and his sidekicks would use various methods to get into the vaults, where they would break into safe deposit boxes and steal anything of value: bonds, cash, jewelry. Anthony realized that the key to a successful robbery depended on quality training and proper equipment. He spared no expense in buying tools that could make his and his men's work easier. Anthony bought a special torch capable of breaking through the steel of any safe. His team also used a van with bulletproof tinted windows during robberies. Sometimes the gangs would even specifically purchase an alarm system to the one installed in the store of interest to prepare to bypass it in advance. Any break-in would begin with reconnaissance, which could last for days. One of the gang members would park the van in the vicinity of the bank and then leave. To outsiders, it might have looked like there was no one in the van, but that was not the case. Two men would stay inside the van, and in succession, they would note all the bank's employees, when they came to and left work, in which cars and with what license plates. And only when they were sure that there was no one inside did they get to work. After a successful robbery, all the loot was carefully counted. Anthony had contacts with both white-collar workers buying stocks and bonds, and with buyers, who, without asking too many questions, paid for the jewelry in cash. It was estimated that during its existence, the gang was able to steal cash and jewelry in excess of $100 million. By the way, here's an interesting fact. One of the members of Anthony's team, Frankie Beansy Mealy, was friends with actor James Caan, the performer of the role of Sonny in The Godfather by Francis Ford Coppola. Beansy told him about what he did for a living, describing the tools Casso's team used to break into safes. What he heard so impressed Caan that he told it to an acquaintance of the director Michael Mann. A few years later, the movie Thief was released, in which the main character remotely resembles Anthony Casso. As he watched his protege grow, Fernari assigned him more complex tasks. Shortly after the death of Anthony's father, he asked him for one favor. Fernari had a business partner named Sammy the Jew who dealt in marijuana. Sam had numerous connections through which he learned that one of his clients was a police informant. The source who gave Sam this information worked for the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, so this was a serious matter. Sam enlisted the help of Fernari, who instructed Anthony to kill the snitch. Casso did it in the best way, and after he became known not only as a talented safecracker, but also a good killer. In the early 1970s, Casso became involved in the marijuana trade. In the spring of 1971, through Vic Amuso, Anthony met a Florida drug dealer named Oscar. Not only did he agree to sell weed from South America, but he set Casso up with the captain of a fishing trawler that brought in the goods. The meeting usually took place at sea in the middle of the night, and an agreed-upon location. The trawler would meet a motorboat, onto which bales of marijuana were quickly loaded. Weed brought in a good income. But Casso wanted more, and soon began to trade cocaine and heroin. In time, Gaspipe even rented a warehouse in Sheepshead Bay where he kept a supply of marijuana. Business was going so well that Casso soon bought 3 shrimp trawlers himself. Rumor has it that he even bought a Boeing 707 cargo plane to deliver drugs directly from South America, but I could not find any confirmation. Gradually, Anthony began to attract the attention of law enforcement. In the fall of 1972, FBI agents arrested Casso. Not only Anthony, but other members of his team were also arrested that ill-fated evening. Anthony posted bail and was soon free again, but he needed to find out who might have turned him into the feds. From his attorney, Michael Rosen, he learned that the snitch was Bobby Denish. He was not a member of Casso's team, but had only given the team minor assistance on a few occasions. Casso reached out to his friend Gregory Scarpa, who we've already covered in one of the videos on the channel. Anthony met with Scarpa and told him about his problem. Gregory listened to him and said he would do everything in his power. Scarpa learned through his FBI channels that Denish was then in Topeka, Kansas, where the feds had put him away. Casso managed to get word to Denish, saying that if he didn't identify him at his trial, he would no longer be in Anthony's debt. Denish was so startled at being found so quickly that he immediately agreed to the terms offered. Casso learned an important lesson from this situation. In order to stay out of jail, it is vital to have your own sources in law enforcement. He soon partnered with Stephen Caracappa and Louis Eppolito, two NYPD detectives who, without asking too many questions, began to share information with him. Their services were generously paid for by Anthony. Casso also did not forget to meet with Scarpa, who in turn shared with him what he had learned from FBI agents. Scarpa and Casso became noticeably close. They did more and more stunts together, from hijacking truckloads of merchandise to robbing at JFK Airport. Anthony liked Greg, and the latter even offered to support him so that Casso would be accepted into the Colombo family, but Anthony politely declined the offer. In 1974, Anthony Gaspipe Casso officially became a member of the Lucchese family. Along with him, his longtime comrade named Vittorio Vic Amuso was welcomed into the family. Casso and Amuso became part of Christopher Fernari's team. Around that time, Casso also got his own man in the FBI. That agent was Doug McCain. He provided Casso with information about the investigations his bureau was conducting. Anthony generously paid for such information and was not greedy to share with other mobsters, regardless of what family they belonged to. Casso realized that the volume of drugs he was bringing into the country would sooner or later attract the attention of the feds. As the future showed, that moment would come very soon. The Rat was one of Casso's cronies named Paul Bennett. It was he who had equipped Casso's vehicles with cleverly concealed compartments to hide the goods in. Bennett was not a bad engineer, but he was not a good drug dealer. The cops arrested him when he tried to sell 10 pounds of weed, and to avoid going to jail, Paul decided to tell the cops everything he knew about Casso's drug dealings, such as the Terry's Dream Trawler that Anthony used to transport goods from Colombia to the States. The feds reported the vessel's identity to the Coast Guard and Marine Patrol. When the trawler docked in far Rockaway Bay and the crew began unloading, the feds surrounded the pier. The cops' catch was nearly 9 tons of marijuana, with a wholesale value of nearly $5 million. With the help of FBI agent Doug McCain, Casso quickly figured out who the feds had learned about the flight from. To get back at Bennett, he decided not to use hitmen from the Lucchese family, but instead assigned Roy DeMeo to carry out the hit. Since Roy's earnings depended largely on selling drugs, he happily completed this task. A few days later, Paul Bennett was shot dead on the doorstep of his home. The same fate soon befell others involved in the failed delivery, like the ship's captain and his son, who served as assistant captain. In Casso's opinion, they should have been killed because they knew too much and there was a risk that the feds could crack down on them. In late 1980, Christopher Fernari, who had then become a consigliere, suggested that Casso become a capo. In Fernari's opinion, Anthony fully deserved the position. Casso was flattered by the consigliere's words, but declined the offer. However, Casso advised Christopher to look at the candidacy of Vic Amuso, who in his opinion was ripe for the job. At the same time, Anthony organized a new scheme to import drugs into the country. Now marijuana came to New York through the bays of City Island in the Bronx, and then it was transported by truck to a warehouse in Brooklyn. Casso also got involved in cocaine shipments. From Colombia, the powder was shipped in airplanes that landed at the small airport in Fort Lauderdale. It is rumored that for one shipment of cocaine, Anthony paid the Colombians $1 million. One of Gaspipe's best customers in the drug business was Gerard Papa. One of the ways Gerard made money was through Arista Windows. Along with his partner Peter Savino, Gerard was replacing windows as part of a major city project. Because the Lucchese family controlled the local 580 union, its leadership could also appoint the firms that would receive the most lucrative contracts. Papa and Savino approached Fernari and Gaspipe to lend them money to start the firm. Gaspipe invested $500,000, which the guys used to buy a warehouse and make repairs there. Girard thought that while the warehouse was being repaired, they could hide the bodies of their defeated enemies there. In the spring of 1980, Papa killed 2 men and threw their remains into the foundation. One of those killed was Shorty Spiro, a member of the Colombo family. This murder was not an authorized killing, and it wasn't long before Girard had to pay the price for murdering a family member. On June 16, 1980, he was killed by a Colombo family hitman. Nevertheless, the window business thrived and bore fruit. The deal was made in such a way that the 4 families, Lucchese, Colombo, Gambino, and Genovese, made a lot of money, as each window brought in a profit. Around the same years, Anthony Casso met a man from the Soviet Union, Marat Balagula. This man made his fortune in the gasoline racket, which we described in more detail in the video about the Russian Mafia in the United States. When Marat started having problems with the Colombo family, he asked Christopher Fernari to settle the matter in exchange for a percentage of the profits. In the early 1980s, the entire Cosa Nostra, and the Lucchese family in particular, began to have major problems. The Luccheses had long controlled a waste disposal business on Long Island. There was also a small private firm there owned by Robert Kubica. He refused to work with the mob and, tired of constant threats and intimidation, turned to the police for help. The feds thought that Kubica could be useful and suggested that he wear a wire and secretly record all of his meetings with Mafia representatives. Kubica was unable to tape a meeting with Salvatore Avellino, who was in charge of garbage collection, but the information he gathered convinced the judge to authorize a wiretap of Avellino's home phone. Afterward, it turned out that Avellino hardly used his home phone, since he spent all day traveling with Anthony Carallo, the family boss. In 1983, a recording device was installed in the dashboard of Avellino's car. The feds were able to record numerous conversations in which Carallo discussed the family's affairs and relationships with other families. When these recordings were turned over to federal prosecutors, they created quite the havoc. These audio recordings became one of the centerpieces of the commission's case, which resulted in major RICO charges against multiple high-ranking members of New York families. Only Paul Castellano was left out of the dock among the bosses. He was murdered on December 16, 1985 in downtown Manhattan, which you can learn more about in the John Gotti and Salvatore Gravano videos on our channel. Just as the family bosses were waiting for the trial to begin, a Russian friend of Casso's, Marat Balagula, was approached by the Colombo family capo, Michael Franzisi. He demanded money from Balagula, so Balagula, on the advice of Casso, decided to seek help from Fernari. The latter brought all parties together for a meeting at which it was decided that since Balagula was making so much profit, there would be enough for everyone. Over time, Balagula and the others' fuel scam became one of the most lucrative businesses in all of Cosa Nostra, second only to drug trafficking. After that, Balagula thought he could sleep well. He considered himself Brighton Beach's foremost authority. However, there was a man who dared to challenge him. This daredevil was Vladimir Reznikov, one of the most egregious killers of the Russian crime community. On June 12, 1986, Reznikov drove up to Balagula's office and started shooting at him with an AK-47. One of Marat's friends was killed and several people were wounded. Reznikov then went to the Odessa nightclub. Guards standing at the entrance had heard about Reznikov's reputation, so no one even tried to stop him. With a gun in his hands, Vladimir approached Balagula, who was there at the club, and put the gun to his temple. He said that if Balagula did not give him $600,000, his entire family would be killed. The frightened Marat replied that he would pay up the next day at the same place, and so Reznikov left. Balagula was so frightened that he had a heart attack. However, he managed to tell Casso about the incident, who took the threat and run as a threat against himself. Anthony calmed Marat down and asked him for a picture of Reznikov. When Vladimir arrived at the Odessa the next day, Balagula was not there. Reznikov decided to go to his house, but at the moment he was opening his car door, several shots rang out. The shooters were Casso's men, Anthony Center and Joey Testa, former members of Roy DeMeo's team. Meanwhile, Tony Carallo, boss of the Lucchese family, was on trial. He had no illusions about it and was well aware that the authorities would do anything to put him behind bars for the rest of his life. The moment came when he needed to choose a successor. Casso was offered to lead the family, but he declined, again proposing Vic Amuso for the position. And so it was settled. Amuso became the boss of the family, and Casso consigliere. Gaspipe's longtime mentor, Christopher Fernari, was also sent to jail. His team was taken over by Peter "Fat Pete" Chiodo. After the Gambino family was taken over by John Gotti, Genovese family boss Vincent Gigante decided to avenge the murder of Paul Castellano by Gotti's men. However, Genovese family hitmen were unable to kill Gotti, so Casso was brought in and agreed to eliminate him. Anthony learned that on April 16, 1986, that members of the Gambino family would gather at an establishment on 86th Avenue. Casso intended to use explosives to eliminate Gotti. Gigante provided Gaspipe with a bomb expert named Herbie Pate. Together, they decided to place an explosive device under the bottom of Frank DeCicco's car, which was supposed to carry John Gotti. On the appointed day, the explosion sounded, but Gotti was not in the car. Only Frank DeCicco was killed. On September 14, 1986, Casso himself almost became a victim. He tried to shoot a group of killers led by James Heidel, and the direct recipients were the Gambinos. Heidel received the contract to eliminate Casso from the family's capo, Angelo Ruggiero. Later, Ruggiero said that John Gotti was not involved in the murder attempt and knew nothing about it, that the reason they wanted to send Gaspipe to the other world was only because he took too large a share in the heroin trade. Those involved in the assassination attempt were aware of how difficult an assignment they faced. Heidel hoped that killing Gaspipe would improve his standing in the underworld. However, Casso had many connections and acquaintances on his side, both in other crime families and with the police and the FBI. He tried long and unsuccessfully to find out Casso's home address. Only 2 days before the hit attempt, he learned that Gaspipe was going to meet one of his men at the Golden Bull restaurant to settle a matter about stolen bonds. They decided to shoot Casso the moment he got out of the car. However, the assassins were unable to do this. On Sunday evening, the street on which Casso parked his car was practically deserted. He had time to spot a car pulling up with the barrel of a shotgun sticking out of the window. Before he could retrieve his gun from under the seat, the killers drove up to him and fired. Casso was wounded, but managed to get out of the car and run into the restaurant. Because the assailants drove up to Gaspipe's car, they were not immediately able to open the door from their side. So once they were able to get out, their victim had already fled. Casso could not understand who might benefit from his murder. He had always had his detractors. Also, Anthony did not quite understand why such a difficult task was assigned to such inexperienced killers. He needed to find the assassins as quickly as possible and pry everything out of them. After recovering from his wounds, which turned out to be light, Casso immediately met with Scarpa, who first told him that James Heidel had tried to shoot him. It turned out that Casso was somewhat familiar with the man, but could not say anything definite about him. After thanking Gregory, he gave Heidel's name to his FBI informant Doug McCain, who was able to find out that Heidel had a great-uncle, Daniel Marino, who was supposedly related to the Gambino family. McCain also gave Casso the address of Heidel's mother, with whom Heidel was living. Now it was the turn of the corrupt cops, Eppolito and Caracappa. Gaspipe ordered them to grab Heidel and bring him in. They did their job, and on October 18th of the same year, Heidel was taken in the trunk of a car to one of Gaspipe's safe houses. The unsuccessful killer was beaten, then gave up everyone's names, including Angelo Ruggiero, the ones who were with him in the car at the time of the botched assassination, and the one who was supposed to back them up. Heidel's words convinced Casso that John Gotti was behind the attempt on his life. Gaspipe decided to arrange something like a trial. He called for Gotti and Gravano to hear what they had to say after listening to Heidel. Gotti declined the invitation but sent two capos, Joe Butch Corrao and Handsome Jack Giordano. In their presence, Heidel repeated once more all that he had previously told Casso, whereupon, in front of the envoys, he was shot and killed. Gotti's men assured Casso that their boss had nothing to do with it, and that they would personally see to it that Ruggiero got what he deserved. Meanwhile, Gaspipe began to methodically eliminate all those who, in his opinion, had anything to do with the attempt on his life. Not even Fat Vinny, the same racketeer of stolen bonds who Casso was scheduled to meet that ill-fated evening, made it out. He was shot by Caracappa and Eppolito and later found in the trunk of his car. It is possible that Casso would have also reached Ruggiero, but on December 5, 1989, he died of cancer. However, Casso had so many problems on the horizon that made the assassination attempt look like a small misunderstanding. The feds managed to induce one of the owners of Arista Windows, a former partner of Gerard Papp named Peter Savino. He was persuaded to put a recording device on, and what Savino was able to do exceeded their wildest expectations. He was able to tape a conversation with Vincent Gigante. He liked Savino and his sense of humor and lost his guard when talking to him. Several times, Savino saw that the Genovese boss was not a madman, as he tried to convince others, and as you can see in the video about Gigante on our channel, but acted rather like a normal person. Gaspipe found out about Peter Savino wearing a wire from Doug McCain. He needed to take action urgently, so Casso immediately arranged a meeting with Vincent Gigante and told him everything. Thanks to his contacts with the FBI, he knew that the feds were getting closer and closer to him every day, that it wouldn't be long before he and Vic Amuso would be indicted on racketeering charges. So, after consulting with their lawyers, Casso and Amuso decided that their best option was to lay low for a while. During the time they were hiding from justice, it would become clear what evidence the courts had. Casso and Amuso then planned to turn themselves into the authorities, and with the help of lawyers, fight off all charges. Gaspipe did not want to be at large, but he had no other choice. He was aware that his disappearance would be top news for a long time, and his name would be on the FBI's most wanted list. During the absence of Casso and Amuso, power in the family passed to Alphonse D'Arco. Gaspipe was also concerned about communications with his subordinates. He wrote down the telephone numbers and exact addresses of several dozen payphones in Brooklyn, Long Island, and the Bronx. With these numbers, and at strictly set times, Casso would contact his men and give them instructions. At the end of May 1990, Anthony left New York. He planned to lay low in Mount Olive in northern New Jersey. Vic Amuso had left 2 weeks earlier for Scranton, Pennsylvania, where he purchased a house months in advance. A few days later, police raided Casso's New York home with a warrant for his arrest. Anthony's wife told the cops that her husband was not at home and she did not know where he was. While the FBI continued to search all over New York City for Gaspipe, he quietly went about his business from afar. Once a week, he met with Alfonso D'Arco at malls or restaurants nearby. He grew a beard and wore baseball caps and sunglasses. Casso made no attempt to contact his wife or children. Only once every 2 weeks did he send her a short message saying he was okay and sending her paper bags of money. Casso at one point was obsessed with getting back at Peter Savino. However, the FBI informant McCain told Gaspipe that Savino was under guard at a military base in Hawaii. There was virtually no chance of getting Savino from there. In the spring of 1991, LUCCHESE member Chiodo was charged with violating the RICO law. He learned from his attorneys that if he lost the case in court, he would have to spend the rest of his life in prison. Therefore, expecting a less severe punishment, Fat Pete decided to plead guilty to the 2 charges. However, by pleading guilty, Chiodo was essentially pleading guilty for Casso and Amuso as well. When this news reached Gaspipe, he immediately contacted D'Arco and told him that Chiodo had to die. Fat Pete learned that there was a contract on his life. He began to behave more cautiously. He left the house less often and looked forward to his sentencing day, after which he could go to prison for 10 years with a clear conscience. Chiodo was only 45 years old, and he thought that after his release, he would have time to start his life with a clean slate. What Casso didn't know was that Chiodo wasn't going to cooperate with the authorities. He was willing to plead guilty, but he refused to snitch. Since Chiodo was a hitman himself, killing him wasn't easy. Through an employee at the phone company, D'Arco's men were able to tap his phones. They found out that Fat Pete was planning to disappear before the date of his verdict, traveling to upstate New York. However, instead of traveling there by plane, Chiodo decided to go in his own car, which he took to a service station on Staten Island before the long trip. 3 assassins, including D'Arco's son Joe, went to the service station. However, the attempt was poorly organized. Fat Pete noticed the killers approaching him, and then began to shoot back at them. He managed to fire 6 shots at the assailants, but none of the bullets harmed them. Fat Pete himself took 12 bullets. The killers thought he was dead and quickly fled. However, Chiodo survived. As surgeons later said, he was saved by something he had been ashamed of all his life: excess weight. The fat worked as a kind of body armor, and thanks to it, none of the bullets fired hit his vital organs. When Chiodo regained consciousness, he immediately called his lawyers and told them he was ready to become the government's chief witness in the case against Casso, Amuso, and other members of the LUCCHESEs. Meanwhile, in the LUCCHESE camp, panic reigned. A hitman named John Fortuna was sent to the hospital where Chiodo was laid. However, just as John was about to enter the premises, he got arrested by FBI agents. Casso was furious. In his desire to stop Chiodo, he went so far as to send him a message stating that if he testified against him or Amuso, the hitman would murder his elderly parents. Some scholars of Mafia history consider this incident to be the first time that members of a crime family threatened blood relatives. It was believed that blood relatives of a crime family member, regardless of what they had done, were safe. Gaspipe, however, decided to break this rule. He later said that it wasn't actually him but a Musso who gave this order, but it doesn't matter in our narrative. Fat Pete took the threat seriously. His parents, wife, and children were enrolled in the Witness Protection Program. The assassins then decided to kill those they could reach. Their victim was Chiodo's uncle, Frank Signorino. His body, with several bullet wounds, was found in the trunk of his own car. However, Fat Pete was still going to testify. Then the Lucchese killers tried to get to his sister, Patricia Capozzalo. This woman had nothing to do with her brother's affairs, but the killers shot her several times as she returned home after taking her children to school. Despite her injuries, Patricia managed to survive. This assassination attempt further angered Chiodo, as he was very close to his sister. Gaspipe considered Al Diarco to blame for the situation. In his opinion, Diarco had failed in his duties. In July 1991, Casso and Musso called a regular meeting of all the capos, where they decided that Diarco was no longer in charge and that all responsibilities for running the family would then on be shared among the capos. Al felt that his days were numbered. He became paranoid, seeing in every person he met a killer sent by Casso and Musso. In addition, Diarco stole while he was at the helm, which also added to his worries. He increasingly thought that only the FBI could save him. A little earlier, Casso and Musso had another problem worth mentioning. Old tensions with some members of the family had come to a head. The capo of the Lucchese family, Anthony Azzaturo, had run the organization's New Jersey and Florida businesses since time immemorial. He was on great terms with Tony Corallo. However, things changed dramatically when Musso and Gaspipe took over. The younger generation saw the old merits of Azzaturo in the grave and asked the logical question as to why such a successful businessman was not giving out enough money, in their opinion. They demanded more from him, but Azzaturo refused. In his eyes, Musso and Casso were still up-and-comers. In 1987, Azzaturo was charged with violating the RICO law. An old-school mobster, Anthony refused to plead guilty, so he went on trial, which lasted 21 months. To their credit, Casso and Musso left the veteran family man alone while the trial went on. The criminal trial ended with Azzaturo and 20 others in the dock, with him being found not guilty. On this occasion, Casso and Musso decided to organize a small family party at their home in Brooklyn, to which almost all representatives of the Lucchese family from New Jersey were invited. However, only half of the Jersey team showed up for this feast. Those gathered decided that Casso was going to trap them, so they quickly left. Gaspipe and Musso considered this an insult. A messenger was immediately dispatched to Jersey and convinced half of Azzaturo's men to return to the restaurant. The other half remained loyal to their acquitted boss. Soon, rumors began to swirl about Azzaturo. One of them said that Azzaturo was a police informant. Some believed the rumors and some didn't, but most of Azzaturo's crew defected to Gaspipe's side. In the end, 14 crew members remained loyal to the captain. Casso ordered every one of them killed. He also sent assassins to Azzaturo himself and his son. Anthony, along with his son, chose to wait out the hard times in Florida. Unlike the killers from New York, they knew the area well, and they could count on the help of bought-out police. Once, such help came in handy. Father and son noticed something on the surveillance and called the cops, and they arrested Casso's squad. Meanwhile, New Jersey police filed a second case against Azzaturo, and he was once again brought to trial. This time, the capo was found guilty of racketeering and faced up to 35 years in prison. Anthony began to have health problems, and, in principle, any term for him could become a life sentence. The old mobster, always following the rule of omerta, was not going to change his principles now. But soon he received the news that shook him to the core. Casso's hitmen killed his 45-year-old wife. This was the last straw for Azzaturo, and he decided to cooperate with the investigation. He told detectives what he knew about the family's activities in New Jersey. Casso and Musso now had to fight on two fronts simultaneously, against Fat Pete and Azzaturo. The first to fall into the hands of the feds was Vic Musso, who was arrested in Scranton on July 19, 1991. Rumors say he was turned in by one of his own, having called the police the day before and given them the exact place and time where the Rico family boss could be picked up. Musso was charged with violating the RICO law and denied bail. The head of the family on the outside became Casso. On September 19, 1991, Gaspipe held another meeting with the capo. Al Diarco showed up, looking more like a living corpse than a healthy man. Al was always waiting for a blow from Casso. He had lost weight and had bags under his eyes. From the outside, it would seem that it was he, and not his boss, who was on the run. In the midst of the meeting, the family's soldier, Michael DeSantis, showed up unannounced and uninvited. He specialized in assassinations, and Gaspipe often used his services. Why he showed up for this meeting is unknown, but Diarco noticed a gun in his waistband. Deciding under false pretenses that DeSantis had shown up to kill him, Al excused himself from the meeting, went home, and told his wife what he had seen. She advised him to go to an FBI office outside of New York City, so Diarco could avoid any of the feds working for Casso. A few hours later, Al was sitting in front of FBI agents. He was so scared that he agreed to talk to the detectives only in the restroom, explaining that Casso and his men were everywhere and could overhear the conversation. The incarcerated Vic Amuso was also hooked on paranoia. He was being held at the federal prison in Danbury, Connecticut, where coincidentally, one of Gaspipe's men, John McCarthy, was serving at the same time. John had a number of bribed guards in his pocket who provided him with everything he needed. When Casso found out about this, he decided, with the help of the guards, to arrange for Vic's escape. Gaspipe's men rented a house about a mile from the prison and prepared a set of clothes for Amuso, who, according to their plan, was to leave the prison grounds with a group of visitors after changing his clothes. But when everything was ready for the escape, Amuso refused to leave his cell. He figured that the whole escape was a clever trap from Casso. In mid-January 1993, he was found guilty of violating the RICO law and sentenced to life in prison. Gaspipe, on the other hand, remained at large. He continued to tend to his family's affairs and made more frequent visits to Brooklyn. Casso believed that each day the prosecution's case against him was melting away, that if he stayed on the run for a year and a half, he would be able to return to normal life. He was so convinced of his exceptionalism that he even allowed his wife to visit him. However, on January 19, 1993, Gaspipe was arrested. According to FBI agents, his location was discovered by a cell phone. There is a version which states that the feds were able to get on Casso's trail because of his companion, Burton Kaplan, shortly before his arrest, since he was visiting Casso on business. The feds conducted a search and $375,000 were found in the house. That same day, Gaspipe appeared before a judge and was sent to jail without bail. Once behind bars, Casso immediately struck up a relationship with a corrupt security guard, Thomas Moore. At first, Moore brought Gaspipe food from an Italian restaurant for $500 a month. Then Casso realized he could be trusted and instructed him to get 2 guns, a cell phone, a knife, and a set of clothes. Moore worked in prison dispatch and had access to the prison's internal surveillance cameras. Casso devised a plan to leave the prison during Moore's shift. Under the guise of meeting with lawyers, he would take the elevator down to the first floor. Moore also operated the elevators, and then, without drawing attention to himself, he would take Moore's gun and go outside. The plan didn't work, however, because one of the guards saw Gaspipe in the elevator alone and unaccompanied, which was prohibited by regulations, so Casso went back to his cell. But Anthony really wanted to escape from prison and was constantly inventing escape plans. According to one plan, he was going to go down to the first floor of the prison in the visitor's elevator and exit through a side door, which had only one officer on nearby duty. Casso was going to disarm and handcuff him and then walk out onto the street, where he would be met by his accomplices in a car. But a few days before the scheduled escape, on February 26, 1993, there was a famous incident in the World Trade Center parking garage, and security at the prison was significantly beefed up. Another plan called for his men to attack a police van as Casso returned to the prison from a Brooklyn courthouse. However, Vic Amuso found out about this plan and vetoed it. The government offered Casso a deal under which he would plead guilty and be sentenced to 22 years in prison. If Gaspipe were to accept these terms, he could have been released on good behavior after serving about 15 years. Casso was slow to respond. He thought that even 15 years behind bars was too long. He knew of another mobster that had made a deal with the government, Phil Leonetti of Philadelphia, who was able to bargain the feds down to just 5.5 years. In February 1994, Gaspipe began cooperating with the investigation, pleading guilty to 72 counts. He was transferred to the La Tuna prison in Texas, where ironically he was held in the same cell where Joe Valachi, The same man who told the nation about Cosa Nostra's setup on television 40 years earlier had been imprisoned. His cooperation with the feds was not smooth sailing, however. As soon as Gaspipe mentioned Doug McCain to the detectives, they immediately demanded that he never speak his name again. Casso's story about the corrupt cops, Caracapo and Ippolito, was treated much more favorably. Gaspipe also told about Burton Kaplan and how he had mediated between him and the police, and how he had repeatedly handed them money. Casso did not forget to tell about the murder of Frank DeChico. But when Gaspipe began his story about how Sammy Gravano was the one who bought the most drugs from him, the agents asked him to stop. When he tried to find out why he couldn't talk about it, he was told to shut up and threatened with solitary confinement. Gradually, Gaspipe began to realize that the government was eager to protect Gravano's interests at all costs. And it was disadvantageous to Sammy to use Casso as a witness against him. If Gaspipe were to go on stand and tell the story of his drug dealing with Gravano, the unpleasant truth would come out, contradicting everything Sammy had said on the stand. His credibility as a witness would have plummeted, and he could have been tried for lying under oath. This, in turn, would allow all those convicted by Gravano's testimony to appeal. Casso appeared before various committees and testified before the Senate Subcommittee on Russian Organized Crime. Gaspipe told more and more details of the atrocities committed, but the authorities were in no hurry to fulfill their promises. Investigators were inclined to believe Casso's stories, but the fact that he was the only eyewitness to many of the crimes made him an unreliable witness. His information was unlikely to interest judges. Even in the 2000s, when Gravano was arrested for drug distribution and Gaspipe's stories about Sammy seemed to be corroborated, attitudes toward him did not change. The FBI and federal agents turned out to be far more corrupt and treacherous than the entire Mafia combined. It was becoming obvious that the government had no interest in Casso's testimony or making any deal with him. In 1998, Casso was removed from the Witness Protection Program. The formal reason for this was allegedly Gaspipe's numerous violations of the regime. But it was clear to everyone that this was just a pretext. Casso's lawyers appealed, but they were unsuccessful. Gaspipe was soon sentenced to 455 years in prison without parole. The only thing that brightened Casso's prison life, at least a little, was his connection with his wife. She was able to forgive his numerous affairs, did not file for divorce, and continued to raise the children. However, her happiness was short-lived. The government did not provide her or the Casso children with a place in witness protection. Lillian owned a small lingerie store that brought her a good income, but in 2004, problems would appear. A member of the Colombo family, Frankie Sciortino, nicknamed The Bug, came into the store. He told Lillian that her husband had caused him and his friends a lot of harm with his testimony, and that she should make amends. The frightened woman had no one to turn to for help. Without a fight, she gave Frankie $100,000, but a week later he came back and demanded even more. Lillian told Casso everything, but being in a jail cell, there was nothing he could do. The man who used to be feared by all of New York began writing letters to federal judges and prosecutors, asking them to intervene in the situation, but they replied that they could not help. In February 2005, Lillian Casso died of a heart attack. Anthony Casso continued to serve his sentence at ADX Florence, a maximum security prison. In the late noughties, he began having health problems. He was diagnosed with coronary heart disease, prostate cancer, hypertension, and lung problems. In March 2020, Gaspipe was transferred to a jail in Tucson, where he tested positive for COVID a few months later. In November, Casso was moved to a hospital. Attorneys petitioned for him on the grounds of compassionate release, but their plea was rejected. On December 15, 2020, Anthony Gaspipe Casso passed away at the age of 78.